it's more likely that this change in rateable values will have a bigger impact on the market from sellers than from buyers.
Yep.
Obviously, the last 3 years we've seen this huge drop in values, and unfortunately, because they were set at the peak of the market, they give us this horrible psychological reminder of what might have been. Welcome to the Lowdown. I'm here again with my good friend Adam, and we're going to talk today about the latest news in real estate, which is the rateable values in Wellington have gone down by 24%, I believe. Is that right, Adam?
24%.
Did you correct me?
We won't go to one decimal place, but to natural whole numbers, 24%.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today about what that means, and obviously we're getting a lot of questions from buyers, sellers. People saying, what does that mean for house prices? So I think people are interested in it. And should we start by, I'll ask you, Adam, what's your opinion on, do rateable values have any bearing on value?
No, they don't. Value is determined by the intersection of the buyers and sellers in the market, the supply, the demand, and the relative features and benefits and intrinsic value of the property, right? The rateable values, as we both know, are determined for one thing only, and what is that one thing?
The rateable values are determined to determine how much rates we pay.
How much rates we pay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think ironically, it's actually the other way around, isn't it? It's the value of houses that determines the rateable values over time rather than the other way around, right?
That is right.
Rateable values are trailing house prices, not the other way around.
So it's correct. If someone says, look, are rateable values an accurate reflection of a house's value? My answer would be, at the time that the rateable values are done, they would be accurately reflecting market value
change
on average.
Yes. Change on average.
On average. Yeah. So you take the however many thousand houses or properties we've got in Wellington and you say, well, on average, they were set as at September 2024, most recently, right? They tend to be in September every 3 years. So in September 2024, the rateable values would accurately reflect the underlying market value of the property across the entire portfolio of properties. But of course, no one property is average.
That's right.
It's always above average or below average.
Yeah.
Just a question of by how much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, So it's kind of like an interesting guide, or the trends, the movements are interesting if you are looking at the market overall. But if you are looking at one particular property, either as a buyer or a seller, and you're trying to get a guide on how much is this property worth, or how much should I pay for the property, or how much could I get for this property based on its rateable value, throw it away.
I agree. And on the average point, my favourite saying about that, which is stick one hand in a bucket of ice cold water and the other hand in a fireplace, in a raging fire. Do you feel warm on average?
Yes.
And
you do not.
You don't.
You do not. No.
You have a very cold and a very hot hand.
That's right. Yeah.
But the point being, if you take two houses, one at $1 million and one at $500,000, the average is $750, but that doesn't tell you anything about the house that was at $1 million or the house that was at $500,000.
Correct.
It just tells you an average, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I think it's an interesting point. And what about the role that they play in marketing? Because I think that's more interesting, right? Like there are psychological effects that numbers have from a marketing perspective.
Can I suggest we go back just a tiny bit? Because I think a lot of people would want to, I'm sorry, we didn't cover this before, didn't talk about this, I'm just throwing this in there, just ambushing you, but you've done that to me before.
Okay, right. Let's go.
A lot of people, I think, would want to know, well, why? Why have rateable values in Wellington dropped by 24%?
Good point, yeah.
Well,
the reason is because house prices have dropped by roughly that amount in the last 3 years. And they were, the interesting thing is they were set last time, of course, at the absolute peak of the market.
Yeah.
So it's so fascinating to see that. That's just random chance, isn't it? Total random chance.
Total random.
And so when they were set, and I think it was September 2021.
Yep.
Price prices were literally at their absolute peak
in October.
Yeah.
So 1 month out, right? So
amazing.
Basically, as you say, 100% at their peak at that exact moment in time. It's a bit like saying, I want to sell at the absolute peak of the market. No one can ever do it. Well, in this instance, the rateable values were set absolutely at that peak, which is pure bizarre coincidence. And so therefore the degree to which they've dropped since then to September 2024, the most recent numbers, does accurately reflect the drop since the peak.
That time, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, although I think, isn't that we're about 26% if using the, what do you call it, the REINZ house price index is about 26. So there's a bit of variance there.
Well, it's 24% to today.
Is it?
Yeah. And it was 24% to September 2021 and to today. But it was just under 26%, if I recall correctly, from the absolute peak to the absolute bottom, and the absolute bottom, from memory, was late, about a year later, and late 2022.
And to the point about rateable values not having any bearing on value, we've been selling houses for the last 12 months at that 25%, right, with thereabouts, below rateable value, and on average.
That's right.
So the reality is that the higher RV had no bearing on the value.
No.
At all. So to your original point, that it doesn't have any bearing on value.
Yeah. So that's why RVs have dropped so much. That is an accurate depiction of what's actually happened in the market, like we talked about, isn't it? It just so happened that the timing was. I mean, if the RV had been done a year prior, then the drop would be 15% or 10% or whatever.
I mean, I think the marketing effects of RVs are interesting though, because we know that numbers have psychological effects on people. That we can be biased, we can be anchored, they can change our perception of value. So those effects are more interesting to me on a micro level. When you're selling a house, these things can play a role.
I mean, buyers and sellers are fascinated with the RV.
Totally. Yeah. But I think the thing that's interesting, I think, for the public is how counterintuitive, I get sellers that say to me all the time, well, if I was a buyer, I would focus on the rateable value.
Yeah.
So therefore I would make my offer based on that.
Yeah.
But the thing I find fascinating is they're making that judgment or that assessment in a vacuum, where they're just imagining themselves offering on a house and they're imagining it as an RV. But actually, in reality, was that same person saying that to go through a wholesale price, would that be affecting them in that way? Almost certainly not, because otherwise the nature of what we're doing wouldn't be the way it is, right?
And you can kind of understand the logic, right? I own a house and I observe. I've been checking out the market for the last 6 months, 12 months in particular, because I know I'm getting ready to sell, and I see, on average, houses are selling for X% above or X% below rateable value. Therefore, if I change my rateable value upwards, if I contact them and get it and manipulate the rateable value upwards, if that relationship continues to hold, therefore my house will sell for more. If someone does that, what actually happens?
Then the psychological effect is going to be the wrong way around. And so this was to my point I was going to say before, is that if the counterintuitiveness is that as a seller you want to see the highest possible price on there, but the effect that can have to buyers is putting them all off, not getting them interested in the property, right? So actually, counterintuitively, a lower RV can actually have more positive effect because it can stimulate the competition for your house.
Yeah.
So actually, the first number that people see, and there are ways to get around it. If your rateable value is really high, you can provide a guide to the market that is more in keeping with it being realistic, which can help stimulate the competition, and you should do that.
And then even that comparison. Even the relativity between those two numbers. You go, rateable value $1 million, even if the rateable value is artificially high for that property, and you go offers over $895, then that can seem to offer, give the appearance of value, right?
Yeah, so in contrast, it looks like a good deal, right? But these things are so counterintuitive in my experience and what people feel.
Yes.
They want to see the highest number for obvious reasons.
And therefore scary for the sellers.
But it's the relativity that's important.
Yeah.
It's when someone goes to one property and views it and gets an experience of price, and then they go to your property and they get an experience of price. You want that to be a positive contrast, not a negative one.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole process for sellers, for buyers that go through from just becoming interested in it. Then they put time, effort, and energy into that process.
Yeah,
they become more committed to the deal. Then they're thinking about, well, I love it. I've got to own it. What is it truly worth? What am I going to offer? And suddenly there's so many other influences in terms of the market value. And also a really important point is, someone who's sitting in a chair as a seller, imagining how they would act as a buyer, is very different to a motivated buyer. Once they've missed out on 2 properties, they've seen 30, they've learned the market, they know the market values really well, and then they see a property that they fall in love with. That same person saying that in that chair, in that seller chair, imagining themselves in that situation, where they put into that situation where all that had happened to them and they were now a motivated buyer, they would behave very differently than what they imagine when they're sitting in that chair.
That's right.
And
And they can't fall in love with the property unless they've been there.
Totally.
And getting there is certainly heavily influenced by, as you say, that relative value that the property appears to offer. And if that rateable value has been manipulated artificially upwards, it makes the property appear less to offer less value.
Exactly. Yeah. So one practical thing from this is don't worry about your RV. Don't get it reviewed. There's no sort of financial ego over the rateable value, is there? And it doesn't help you from a marketing perspective. So why change it?
Yeah. People do get upset too when the new RV comes out and it's gone down by 24%. Oh my goodness, what happened to the value of my house? Well, that happened ages ago.
Yeah.
I like to put my RVs down.
Yeah, that's right. There's relative to everyone around you, right?
Well, if it comes in at $1 million and I can get it down to 900, I might save 10% of my rates.
Yeah.
But on that topic, what does that mean? So rateable values are coming down by 24%. So what influence does that have on people's rates?
Nothing.
In and of itself, that has nothing.
Nothing. But if, for example, you have a property that went down by, like what you were just saying there, less relative to your neighbour, you will pay more rates. If it went down more relative to your neighbour, you will pay less rates.
Yeah.
And what influences that, of course, is the amount of work you've done to it, like building consents, for example. If you've put through a whole lot of building consents, they will take that into consideration into that rateable value, those improvements, so to speak, that have a dollar value, and then your rateable value won't go down by as much. You pay higher rates. So that's really the main impact there in terms of rate changes on how you pay rates.
Yeah. So, but I think a lot of people misunderstand that, right? That they think that, okay, rateable values, if rateable values go up by 10%, everyone thinks, the greedy council, they just want us to pay more rates. But in actual fact, how the rates are determined is your rateable value as a proportion of the entire pool of rateable values across the whole city, and that proportion is applied to the city council's rates budget.
Yeah.
Right. So as you say, the key is what is the movement in your rateable value compared to other properties. So if properties rateable values have just come down by 24%, if your RV came down by less than 24%, so for example 20% only, then next time the rates are set, your rates will go up by more than the average.
Yes. Do you know if that is, because I've never actually looked into this, but do you know if there is a difference, if it's across the whole of Wellington or is it by area?
I'm not aware of it being by area, but it might be. I believe it's just by the territorial authority.
Yeah.
I mean, they have slightly different metrics in there as well. Like I think there are some small items like that might be fixed per account, if you like, and so it's not, if your rateable value goes up by 10% or if the relativity goes up by 10%, doesn't mean your rates will go up by 10%. But the largest component of what makes up your rates, I believe, is driven by the rateable value. Yeah.
So one really interesting effect, I think, is more likely. This is my speculation. But I think it's more likely that this change in rateable values will have a bigger impact on the market from sellers than from buyers.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is that we obviously the last 3 years we've seen this huge drop in values.
Yep.
Rateable values have still been incredibly high, and unfortunately because they were set at the peak of the market, they give us this horrible psychological reminder of what might have been.
Yes, true.
Right?
How much money have I missed out on?
Had we just perfectly sold at the absolute peak, we would have got somewhere around what thereabouts around what that might have been. And the issue is, of course, loss aversion. We know that humans weigh the sense of loss greater than the sense of gain, so they're not thinking about the fact that they, since 2015 they've had an 80% or 75% gain in value. They're thinking about the fact that based on their rateable value showing what it might have been at the peak, they're going to lose 20-30%, right?
Yep.
And so this is all very subconscious, and I'm not saying that people are actually thinking about it, but I do have the sense that when people are faced with their new rates thing and they see that new price, because we've been dealing with the illiquidity of the market for the last 3 years, that seller expectations and buyer expectations have been so far away. And of course, that may lubricate the market to some degree, people being a little more likely to be realistic when they get that shock of the change in the value and a bit more reality coming into their mind. So it's just a speculation, but I suspect it may have some impact on some people.
So if I understand you right, just to summarise, you're suggesting that the rateable values having come down will basically drive the message home to sellers that maybe the house isn't worth what they thought it was. This is, if they're being anchored on a number that's a lower number, that might just help them be more realistic in terms of the value of their property. And
well, partly because 24, 25, 26%, that's a quarter.
That's a
right?
lot. That's a
but
lot.
the brain doesn't immediately do that calculation when you're looking at your RV and you're thinking about, they know that the market's been bad, but a quarter
Yes.
is a huge change. And so when you're then faced with this new rate of value and you see that price, you start to sink in a bit more what that really means.
The actual number of dollars.
The actual number of dollars.
So you go from $1 million to 724% down to 760. Or, 2 million down to just over 1.5 million.
Huge change, right?
It's a large number.
And so had your expectations, maybe you were sort of like thinking 1.8 or, because the market's bad and your RV's 2 million and stuff, and then you see, oh my God, the rateable value has changed to 1.5.
Yeah.
Then suddenly the gravity of what 25% actually means weighs a bit stronger.
I think another thing, I've heard some commentary out there about, gosh, the drop in Wellington values and what's happening in Wellington. Why has this happened? And I don't think people realise that actually that drop happened in the first 12 months after those last rates were set. Since late 2021, since late 2022,
early 2023,
values in Wellington have been broadly stable.
Yeah, that's
up a bit, down a bit. As you know, they went up a bit leading into the election, and they've come down a bit since the election. The last few months, as we sit here in February, been flat for the last few months. But that over the last over 2 years, values have not really changed in Wellington. So the change happened quite some time ago.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, that's a great segue into our point here, just around, the next 3 years. What do you think in terms of, we've got the RVs will be reviewed in exactly 3 years' time. And of course, how do you think about that?
September 2027.
Just rub a crystal ball for a bit. What do you think?
Oh, what are they going to be? Oh, what will they be then? Well, we've talked about this quite a bit, haven't we? That we think that there's a big backlog of buyers who've been waiting to buy or terrified because they think prices fell, also locked out of the market a bit because of their inability to raise the finance. That now, stable prices give them confidence, easy to get finance, give them ability to enter the market again. So we have this backlog of buyers coming back into the market, but equally a backlog of sellers who've been not wanting to sell at the bottom. But then if they get used to this is just the new normal, and if I buy and I sell in the same market, it's all relative value. And so maybe a whole lot of sellers come into the market as well to increase on both sides. So we get much more liquidity, the ability to get on with life on both sides. So more transactions taking place, more sales taking place, but not any significant increases in values as a result. Consistent with that, my best guess would be a small increase.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely.
Yeah.
Well, nice to chat about it.
Wellington RVs, one of the more technical things we've talked about.
Yeah. That was Lowedown. Thanks for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time for another round.
See you next time.